I stood in the hallway at 5:10 in the morning, boarding pass clutched in my hand, suitcase packed and ready by the door. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tore through the house one more time. My passport was gone. I had checked my purse 3 times, emptied my carry-on bag, searched the bathroom counter, where I had left it the night before. Nothing. My husband Philip leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping his coffee with infuriating calmness. His mother Lorraine watched from the doorway, and I caught the faint curve of a smile playing at her lips. When I asked Philip directly if he had moved it, he shrugged and said maybe I was not fit for international travel at my age. The words hit me like a slap. I was 47 years old, not ancient. The humiliation burned through my chest as their smug expressions registered fully. Then I glanced at the clock again, and suddenly I stopped panicking. Something cold and clear settled over me. I straightened my spine and took a deep breath. My name is Rebecca, and I am from Boston, Massachusetts. If you enjoy stories like this about standing up for yourself and reclaiming your power, please subscribe to this channel for more fascinating stories. What happened next changed my life forever. Instead of continuing to search frantically or breaking down in tears like they clearly expected, I went completely quiet. Too quiet. Philip's smirk faltered just slightly. Lorraine muttered from her spot by the door that it was such a shame. Guess I would be staying home after all. The satisfaction in her voice made my jaw clench. That was when I looked at both of them calmly and said I was right. I would not be going with them. Philip's eyes flickered with something that looked like confusion rather than the victory he had been anticipating. I grabbed my purse but left my suitcase standing in the hallway where it had been since last night. I walked out the front door without another word, got into my car, and drove away. Through my rearview mirror, I watched their car pull out of the driveway heading toward the airport. I did not follow them. Instead, I turned in the opposite direction. The morning air felt suddenly lighter. Philip called my cell phone twice during the drive. I let both calls go to voicemail. Whatever game they were playing, I was no longer a willing participant. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt completely in control. I arrived at my bank the moment it opened at 9. The security guard recognized me and nodded as I walked past. I went straight to the safe deposit box area and requested access to my box. Inside were items I had placed there years ago when my father died and left me his estate. My backup passport sat on top, completely valid and ready to use. Beneath it were copies of every important financial record, property deeds, and legal documents that Philip and Lorraine knew nothing about, including the deed to the lake house in New Hampshire that my father had left solely to me. I stared at the papers spread before me and felt something cold settle in my stomach. This passport stunt was not random. It was not Philip being careless or playing a harmless joke. This was strategic. They wanted me rattled, destabilized, questioning myself. I realized with perfect clarity that I had been underestimating exactly how far they were willing to go. The pieces started falling into place. Lorraine moving in with us 6 months ago, supposedly because she was lonely. Philip suddenly taking interest in my inheritance and asking questions about how it was structured. The subtle comments about my age, my memory, my competence. Back at home, I opened the laptop Philip, and I technically shared, though he primarily used it. I noticed something in the drafts folder of his email account. He had never been careful about logging out. The subject line read after Rome. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The email was addressed to his mother. It laid out a detailed plan to convince me during the Rome trip to transfer my inheritance into a joint investment account for supposed tax purposes. They had even researched which lawyer to use, someone Lorraine knew who would make the paperwork seem legitimate. My stomach dropped as I read further. The passport incident was mentioned specifically. Get her off balance. Make her doubt herself. By the time we are in Rome, she will be grateful for guidance. I felt physically sick. The passport disappearance had not been about making me miss a flight. It was about isolating me emotionally and mentally, making me feel incompetent and dependent. It was about setting the stage for financial manipulation. I took screenshots of everything and emailed them to myself at an address Philip did not know I had. Then I closed the laptop and sat in the silent house, understanding fully what my marriage had become. My phone rang an hour later. Philip sounded irritated, not concerned. He said I would not believe it, but he had just found my passport in his desk drawer at home. It must have gotten misplaced somehow. His tone suggested this was my fault for being careless. I let the silence stretch out for several long seconds before responding. I know, I said quietly. He froze. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, processing my words. I told him calmly and clearly that I would not be joining him in Rome. Not today, not ever on this trip. His voice shifted instantly from smugness to something sharper and uglier. Do not embarrass me, Rebecca. My mother and I are already at the airport. People are expecting us. I felt nothing but cold clarity. I told him he should have thought about embarrassment before he hid my passport and tried to gaslight me about my own competence. Then I hung up before he could respond. He called back immediately. I declined the call. He called again. I turned off my phone completely. For the first time in our entire marriage, I was not available to soothe his ego or manage his emotions. By noon, I was sitting in a lawyer's office downtown. Her name was Veronica, and she came highly recommended by a colleague I trusted. I laid out everything. The separate finances I had maintained thanks to my father's advice before he died. The inheritance that was solely mine. The lake house property. The email I had discovered. When I described the passport incident in detail, Veronica's expression hardened. That is coercive control, she said quietly but firmly. It is a form of emotional abuse designed to destabilize you and make you more vulnerable to manipulation. We spent the next 2 hours going through my financial situation. Veronica asked detailed questions about joint accounts, shared assets, and any legal vulnerabilities I might have. The good news was that my father had insisted on a prenuptial agreement before I married Philip. At the time, I had thought it was excessive. Now I understood my father had seen something in Philip that I had missed. We began drafting paperwork. Not divorce papers yet, Veronica cautioned. First, we establish clear boundaries and legal protections around our assets. We freeze joint accounts and create a paper trail documenting his behavior. Then we proceed. That evening, Lorraine showed up at my house instead of boarding her connecting flight to Rome. She claimed she had forgotten something important and needed to pick it up. What she really wanted was to intimidate me back into compliance. She let herself in with the key Philip had given her months ago without asking me. I was sitting at the dining room table with a folder of documents spread in front of me. She launched into a speech about how divorcing her son at my age would be financial suicide. How I would end up alone and struggling. How Philip had been so good to me, and I was being ungrateful over a silly misunderstanding. I let her finish. Then I calmly opened the folder and slid several documents across the table toward her. Bank statements showing my separate accounts. The prenuptial agreement. The deed to the lake house. Veronica's business card. You are mistaken, Lorraine, I said evenly. Philip has access to none of my inheritance, none of my property, and no claim to my assets per our legal prenuptial agreement. For the first time since I had known her, Lorraine looked genuinely unsure. She picked up the papers with shaking hands. While Philip and Lorraine were stuck overseas dealing with the reality that I was not coming, I made another decision. I called a real estate agent I knew and quietly listed the lake house for sale. The property was entirely mine, inherited solely from my father with no marital claim whatsoever. Philip had always assumed he would inherit it someday, or at least have partial ownership. He had talked about retiring there, about the investments we could make in renovating it. But his name had never been on any paperwork. My father had made sure of that. The real estate agent was enthusiastic. The lake house was in perfect condition and located in a highly desirable area. She said we should expect strong interest. Within 48 hours, she called back with news. Multiple offers had come in, 2 of them significantly above asking price. I accepted the highest offer without hesitation. The closing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. I did not tell Philip. There would be time for him to learn about it later. Right now, I needed to secure my assets before he could try to interfere or manipulate me into changing my mind. The lake house sale would give me complete financial independence and remove the last piece of leverage he thought he had. I started seeing photos from Rome appear on social media. Philip and Lorraine posing in front of the Coliseum, smiling widely. Having lunch at a sidewalk cafe. Lorraine had tagged the photos family trip. That word stung more than I expected.
Family.
As if I had never existed. As if I was already erased from their narrative. The comments underneath were full of people saying how lovely they looked, what a wonderful mother-son relationship they had. I scrolled through once, then closed the app. My hands were shaking slightly. But then my phone buzzed with an email notification. The title sale contingencies on the lake house had been cleared. We were proceeding to closing ahead of schedule. The buyers were paying cash and wanted to expedite everything. I would have the money in my account within 10 days. I put my phone down and took a deep breath. Let them have their photos and their performance. I had something far more valuable. My freedom, my assets, and my future were secured. And they had no idea what was coming. Going through our joint banking records more carefully, I discovered something else that made my blood run cold. There was a drafted transfer request in our joint checking account, one that had not been completed yet. It would move $15,000 into an account number I did not recognize. I called the bank immediately and asked them to research the account number. After some verification questions, they told me it was a savings account opened 2 months ago in Philip's name only. He had been planning to drain our joint funds without my knowledge or permission. I immediately requested that the joint account be frozen, pending legal review. The bank representative was understanding and processed the request. She noted my concerns in the account file. That meant when Philip tried to access the money from Italy, the transaction would fail. I felt a grim satisfaction knowing he was about to get a very unpleasant surprise. He had hidden my passport to destabilize me. He had planned to steal from our joint account. And he had been working with his mother to manipulate me into signing away my inheritance. Every single one of those actions was going to have consequences he had not anticipated. The call came at 3 a.m. my time. Philip was furious. His voice was loud enough that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Why could he not access our money? What had I done? Why was the account frozen? I responded calmly, with none of the emotion he was clearly trying to provoke. The account is frozen because it is not just your money, Philip. You were attempting to make an unauthorized transfer. He sputtered something about needing funds for the trip, about how I was being vindictive and unreasonable. I reminded him that jokes do not involve hiding someone's legal identification documents. That manipulation does not include trying to drain joint accounts. His anger shifted to something uglier. He accused me of overreacting about a harmless prank. He said I was being emotional and irrational. The same words he always used when he wanted to make me doubt my own perception of reality. But this time they did not work. I told him clearly that when he returned, we would be having a serious conversation about the future of our marriage. Then I hung up. He called back repeatedly. I turned off my phone and went back to sleep, more peacefully than I had slept in months. Philip and Lorraine returned from Rome 3 days early. Not by choice. Without access to the joint account funds, and with Philip's credit cards apparently reaching their limits, they could not afford the second leg of their trip. I learned this from a mutual friend who had seen them at the airport looking furious. When Philip stormed into the house, he immediately started demanding explanations. Why had I frozen the account? Who did I think I was? Did I have any idea how humiliated he had been? I was sitting calmly in the living room. I handed him a folder containing legal paperwork that Veronica had prepared. It outlined a formal financial separation, detailing which accounts were joint, which were mine alone, and establishing clear boundaries going forward. Lorraine read over his shoulder. I watched her hand start to shake as she reached the page about the prenuptial agreement and my protected assets. Philip threw the papers on the coffee table. This is insane, Rebecca. You are blowing everything out of proportion. I said nothing. My silence seemed to unsettle him more than any argument would have. He looked at his mother for support, but even she seemed uncertain now. Philip tried a different approach. He sneered at me with that familiar condescending expression. You cannot survive without me, Rebecca. You have no idea how to manage finances or handle real-world decisions. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. I looked at him directly and said calmly that the lake house had sold yesterday. The closing was complete. The money was already deposited in my personal account. His face drained of all color. He stared at me like I had spoken a foreign language. "You cannot sell what is half mine," he said, but his voice had lost its confidence. I slid the property deed across the table toward him. The original deed, from when my father left it to me. Philip's name appeared nowhere on the document. It had never been his, not even partially. I watched him read through the deed twice, his hands trembling slightly. Lorraine grabbed it from him and read it herself. Her face went pale. All those discussions about retiring there, about the renovations they had planned, about treating it as their future escape. It had all been fantasy based on an assumption that was legally groundless. The argument that followed went on for hours. Philip kept insisting I had tricked him somehow, that I had hidden assets and information from him during our marriage. I had done no such thing. He had simply never asked direct questions or paid attention to legal documents. He had assumed that marriage meant access to everything I owned. His mother finally snapped under pressure. She admitted they had been planning to convince me in Rome to sign over my inheritance into a family investment trust that Philip would control. The passport trick was meant to shake my confidence and make me feel unstable and dependent. Hearing her say it out loud, admitting the manipulation so casually, changed something fundamental in me. Whatever love or affection I had once felt for Philip dissolved completely in that moment. I was looking at a stranger. Someone who had been willing to gaslight me, steal from me, and manipulate me with his mother's help. I stood up and told them both to leave my house. Philip started to argue that it was his house too. I corrected him. The house was purchased with my inheritance money before our marriage. Per the prenuptial agreement, it remained my sole property. "Get out," I repeated. Word spread quickly among our extended family that the lake house had been sold. Philip's siblings started asking questions. His sister called me directly, confused about what was happening. I calmly explained that the property had always been mine alone, and I had decided to sell it. She pressed for details about the Rome trip and why I had not gone. I gave her the basic facts. Philip had hidden my passport, I had discovered his plan to manipulate my finances, and I was taking steps to protect myself legally. She went silent on the phone. Then she said quietly that she wished she was surprised, but she was not. Apparently, Philip had a history I had never known about. Financial problems before we met. A pattern of borrowing money from family members and never paying it back. His sister told me she had tried to warn her mother years ago, but had been shut down. I thanked her for telling me and hung up feeling both validated and sad. Philip tried to control the narrative, telling people I was being impulsive and emotional. But I had documentation. Financial records. The email draft I had found. Property deeds. When people asked me directly, I showed them proof. The narrative shifted quickly. I revealed something Philip had apparently forgotten about completely. Our prenuptial agreement was not just a simple document. It was ironclad, drafted by my father's attorney specifically to protect my inheritance and any assets I owned before the marriage. Philip got nothing from my father's estate. Nothing from the lake house sale. Nothing from my personal investment accounts. When Veronica showed him the full prenuptial agreement in her office, he seemed genuinely shocked. Had he never read it carefully before signing? Had he assumed it was just a formality that would not matter? Whatever he had believed, the reality was now clear. His assumption that marriage entitled him to everything I owned was completely wrong. Veronica went through each clause methodically, showing Philip exactly how the agreement protected me. His face grew redder with each page. When she finished, he tried to argue the agreement was invalid, that I had somehow coerced him into signing it. Veronica shut that down immediately. He had been represented by his own attorney at the time. He had signed willingly. The agreement was completely enforceable. There was nothing he could do to challenge it successfully. Philip left that meeting looking like a man who had just realized he had lost everything. At my request, Veronica arranged for a forensic accountant to review all our joint financial records going back 5 years. What they found was disturbing but not surprising. Small transfers had been made regularly over the past 2 years from our joint account into an account tied to Lorraine. Nothing large enough to be immediately obvious. $50 here, $100 there. Sometimes larger amounts labeled as gifts or family help. Cumulatively, it totaled nearly $8,000. When confronted with the records, Philip claimed it was just helping family during difficult times. I asked him directly why he had never discussed these transfers with me if they were legitimate help. Why had they been hidden? Why had the money gone to an account I did not even know existed? He had no good answer. I told him clearly that he did not get to make those decisions with joint money without my knowledge and agreement. Veronica made copies of all the transfer records. They would become part of the divorce filing documentation, demonstrating a pattern of financial deception. Not criminal exactly, but certainly unethical and dishonest. It was more evidence of who Philip truly was behind the mask he had worn for years. At a family gathering the following week, Lorraine made a last attempt to control the narrative. She stood up in front of Philip's entire extended family and started a speech about how I was breaking up the marriage over nothing. How her son had done nothing wrong. How I was being vindictive and cruel. I let her talk for a full minute before I interrupted calmly. Then I recounted the passport incident in precise detail. I described finding it in Philip's desk drawer. I described the smirk on both their faces that morning. I mentioned the email I had found outlining their plan to manipulate me in Rome. The room went completely silent. You could hear ice clinking in glasses. Philip's sister spoke up and said she believed me. Another family member said they had noticed concerning behavior from Philip, but had not known how to bring it up. Lorraine tried to interrupt, to regain control. But I kept talking. I described the unauthorized bank transfers, the attempt to drain our joint account while they were overseas, the assumptions about my property and inheritance. By the time I finished, Lorraine was sitting down, her face pale. Philip looked furious, but said nothing. The damage to his reputation was done. A week later, Philip tried a completely different approach. He showed up with flowers and tears streaming down his face. He said he had been under tremendous pressure from his mother, that she had convinced him to do things he knew were wrong. He begged for another chance. For a brief moment, I felt something that might have been sympathy. Then I remembered his voice that morning at 5:10, telling me I was not fit for international travel at my age. The calculated cruelty of that moment. The deliberate attempt to humiliate and destabilize me. I accepted the flowers and thanked him for the apology. Then I told him it was too late. Some things could not be repaired. He cried harder, insisting he loved me and had made a terrible mistake. But his tears felt performative, like everything else. When I did not immediately forgive him or offer reconciliation, his demeanor shifted. The tears stopped. The anger returned. He accused me of being cold and unforgiving. I told him he was right. I was done forgiving behavior that never changed. He left the flowers on my porch and drove away. I put them in the trash. Philip proposed marriage counseling as a last effort. He promised complete transparency going forward. He said he would cut his mother out of our financial discussions. Against my better judgment, and at Veronica's suggestion that it might be useful for divorce proceedings, I agreed to one session. We sat in the therapist's office together. Philip minimized the passport incident almost immediately. He called it a misunderstanding, a joke that went too far. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Brennan, stopped him. She asked him to describe exactly what he had done and why. Philip stumbled through an explanation that made it sound accidental. Dr. Brennan turned to me and asked for my perspective. I laid out everything factually. The hidden passport, the smirk, the email planning financial manipulation, the frozen accounts. Dr. Brennan's expression hardened. She looked at Philip directly and told him what he had done was not a misunderstanding. It was calculated humiliation and a form of coercive control. Philip stood up abruptly. He said this was exactly why therapy never worked, because therapists always sided with women. Then he walked out. I sat in the silence that followed. Dr. Brennan looked at me kindly and said I was making the right choice in leaving. I filed for divorce the following week. Not out of anger or spite, but with complete clarity about who Philip was and what our marriage had become. Veronica handled all the paperwork. Based on the prenuptial agreement and the documentation we had gathered, Philip would receive only what was legally his from joint assets. No inheritance. No lake house proceeds. No access to my separate accounts. He tried to fight it initially. His attorney made aggressive demands, claiming Philip deserved compensation for years of marriage and contributions to my success. Veronica demolished those arguments systematically. Philip had his own income and career. I had kept my finances separate per our prenuptial agreement. He had no legal claim to my inheritance or premarital assets. The court date was set. Philip's attorney eventually advised him to accept the settlement terms rather than risk going before a judge. The divorce would be final within months. I felt nothing but relief. My future was my own again. Philip could no longer access my money, my property, or my peace of mind. It was over. Without access to my income and assets, Philip's financial situation deteriorated quickly. He had been living beyond his means for years, apparently assuming my inheritance would eventually supplement his lifestyle. The credit card debt from the aborted Rome trip lingered. His mother could not help him. Her own finances were apparently far more precarious than she had let on. Philip had to sell his car and downgrade his apartment. I heard this through mutual acquaintances, not because I was monitoring him, but because people felt the need to tell me. Some seemed to expect I would feel guilty or concerned. I felt neither. Philip had made his choices. He had attempted to manipulate and steal from me. The natural consequences of those actions were not my responsibility. The family investment trust he and Lorraine had planned never materialized. There was no inheritance to control because I had protected it. Philip started calling me occasionally, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading. I blocked his number. There was nothing left to say. Our marriage was over. The divorce was proceeding. And I was moving forward with my life. Lorraine called me directly one afternoon, weeks after the therapy disaster. Her tone was different. Softer. Almost tentative. She asked if we could meet for coffee and talk privately. She said she wanted to start fresh. I met her at a neutral location, curious what she would say. Lorraine spent the first 10 minutes trying to justify her actions. She said she had been trying to protect her son's financial future, that she had not understood how hurtful the passport incident had been. I listened without interrupting. Then I told her gently but firmly that fresh starts required genuine accountability. Not excuses or justifications, but real acknowledgement of harm caused. Lorraine looked uncomfortable. She said she supposed she could have handled things differently. That was as close to an apology as she seemed capable of offering. I told her it was not enough. I explained that she had participated in a deliberate plan to manipulate me emotionally and financially. That her smirk that morning had revealed exactly what she thought of me. Lorraine's expression hardened. She stood up and left without another word. I sat alone and finished my coffee, knowing I had made the right decision. The divorce finalized quietly on a Tuesday morning in early fall. Philip and I sat on opposite sides of the courtroom with our respective attorneys. The judge reviewed the prenuptial agreement, the property division, and the settlement terms. Everything was straightforward because the agreement was so clear. When the judge confirmed the final asset division, Philip looked physically smaller somehow. Diminished. I felt something unexpected wash over me. Not triumph or vindication. Just peace. A quiet sense of closure. The marriage that had slowly poisoned me was officially over. I was legally free, financially protected, and finally able to move forward with my own life on my own terms. We left through different exits. I did not look back. Outside, Veronica congratulated me and reminded me that all the documents would be filed and finalized within days. I thanked her for everything she had done. Then I walked to my car and sat for a moment in the silence. The relief was overwhelming. I was 47 years old. I had my inheritance, my property, and my independence. Philip had tried to take all of that from me. He had failed. And now I could finally start living the life I deserved. 6 months later, I was standing at the airport again. This time with my passport in hand. valid, secure, and entirely under my control. I was traveling to Rome alone on my own terms, with my own money. The trip I had been denied because of manipulation and cruelty. I checked in, moved through security, and found my gate. As I sat waiting to board, I thought about that morning when Philip had hidden my passport. How panicked I had felt. How small and powerless they had tried to make me. But their cruelty had backfired completely. Instead of breaking me down, they had woken me up. They had shown me exactly who they were. And I had responded not with emotion, but with strategy. I had protected my assets, documented their behavior, and legally freed myself from their control. The boarding announcement came over the speaker. I stood, gathered my carry-on bag, and walked toward the gate. As the plane lifted off, I looked out the window at Boston disappearing below. Philip and Lorraine had tried to keep me grounded, to trap me in their manipulation. Instead, they had taught me how to fly on my own. And this time, nobody could hide my passport. I was free,